The first sound was not the wind. It was the steady crack of steel biting into stone, a rhythm older than any clock, older than any prayer spoken over fresh-turned earth. Long before sunrise, while the valley still slept beneath a pale October sky, in 1883, a girl of 18 stood halfway inside a hillside in Montana Territory, swinging a worn pickaxe into solid limestone, as if every strike carried the weight of another winter she could not afford to lose. Her name was Jessamine Pardee. Most people in Elkhorn Gulch had already stopped using it. They called her the widow or the strange one or nothing at all. She preferred the nothing. It left her hands free. The pickaxe came down again. A chip of pale rock spun through the cold air, catching the first gray light before it disappeared into the dirt at her boots. Her shoulders burned from the repetition. Her lower back had gone numb 2 hours ago. She did not stop. Stopping meant thinking, meant remembering the way Emmett used to whistle through his teeth while he planed a cedar board smooth enough to run a fingertip across without catching a splinter. Stopping meant hearing his voice, which she could still reconstruct perfectly if she let herself, the way he stretched certain vowels when he was tired, the way he shortened her name to Jess on good mornings, the way he once told her that a well-built joint didn't need nails because wood understood wood better than iron ever could. She brought the pickaxe down harder. The limestone groaned. Riders passing on the wagon road below slowed their horses whenever the sound reached them. A few stopped, entirely leaning forward in their saddles to squint up at the hillside, where a thin figure in a too large wool coat disappeared into a hole that seemed to grow deeper by the day. Nobody understood why she was digging into the slope instead of building a cabin or moving to town, or doing any of the 100 sensible things a young widow was supposed to do in a place where sensible things were the difference between breathing in April or not breathing at all. They watched for a minute, maybe two. Then they shook their heads, clicked their tongues, urged their horses forward. The sound of steel on stone followed them down the road like something they could not quite outrun. 5 months earlier, Elkhorn Gulch had looked like a place where futures could take root. The valley sat in a wide crease between two ridge lines in western Montana Territory, close enough to the mining camps to catch their commerce, but far enough to smell like pine instead of sulfur. Timber homes lined the main road. A general store with glass windows, real glass shipped from Helena, anchored the south end of town. A livery stable, a feed lot, a small white church with a bell tower that leaned 2 degrees east but rang true every Sunday morning. The kind of place that wasn't on any map yet, but believed it would be soon. Emmett Pardee had believed it too. He arrived in the spring of 1883 with a new wife, a set of carpentry tools wrapped in oilcloth, $62 in a tin box hidden inside a flour sack. The kind of faith that only exists in men who have not yet been broken by the distance between what they can build with their hands and what the world can take away before the nails have cooled. He was 20, lean, quiet in crowds, but loud when he laughed, which was often. Jess had married him 4 months before they left Missouri. She was 17 then. She had never seen mountains. They claimed a quarter section east of town, the parcel nobody wanted. The valley floor had already been divided among the cattle operations, the best timber lots spoken for by men who arrived a year earlier with more money or more nerve. What remained was a hillside of broken limestone, too steep for grazing, too rocky for plowing, too far from the creek for easy water. The land agent in Helena had practically given it away. Emmett had signed the deed with a carpenter's confidence, the kind that sees raw material where others see waste. He told Jess they would build a cabin first, then a workshop, then maybe a barn if the first 2 winters went well. He taught her to notch logs, to read the grain in green timber, to set a post plumb by feel when the bubble level cracked on the second day. She learned fast. She had to. There was no one else to teach, no one else to learn. Just 2 people on a rocky hillside cutting trees by morning, fitting joints by afternoon, falling asleep against each other in a canvas tent while the stars above Montana Territory burned closer than any stars she had seen in Missouri. The cabin was half finished when the sickness came. Diphtheria moved through Elkhorn Gulch the way water moves through a crack in a dam, slowly at first, almost politely, then all at once. The first case appeared in June, a child on the north end of town. By July, 3 families had lost someone. By August, the disease had crossed the creek, climbed the hill roads, entered homes that had nailed rags over their windows in a gesture that meant nothing to a pathogen carried on breath itself. Emmett started coughing on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he could not swallow. By the following Wednesday, Jess was standing beside a grave she had dug herself because the 2 men in town who handled burials were already digging for someone else. She did not remember the funeral clearly. She remembered the weight of the shovel. She remembered the sound the dirt made when it struck the pine box, a hollow, final sound like a door closing in a house she would never enter again. She remembered that no one came except Samuel Fry, the young clerk from the general store, who stood at a distance with his hat in his hands, not speaking, just present in the way that decent people sometimes are when words would only make things worse. After the last shovelful, Jess sat beside the mound of fresh earth. She did not move for the rest of that day. She did not move through the night. The stars came out, the same ones she had watched with Emmett from the tent, but they looked farther away now, as though grief had pushed the sky back by 1,000 miles. Hunger meant nothing. Cold meant nothing. The tin box with its remaining $41 sat in the pocket of Emmett's wool coat, which he wore because it still smelled like cedar shavings, because putting it on was the closest thing left to being held. At some point before dawn, she cried. Not loudly, not the way people cry in stories meant to make audiences weep along with them. She cried the way a person cries when they realize that the future they imagine, the cabin finished by autumn, the workshop by spring, the barn, if the winters were kind, has been quietly removed from the world like a page torn from a book while the reader was sleeping. When it was over, she wiped her face with the rough sleeve of Emmett's coat. She stood up. The valley below was still dark. The hills above were still silent. Nothing had changed except the person standing between them. The bank took the cabin 12 days later. Emmett had borrowed against the timber. The debt was small by any reasonable measure, but reasonable measures do not apply to institutions that smell weakness the way wolves smell blood. A clerk from Helena arrived with paperwork. The tools, the cut lumber, the canvas tent, the half-finished walls that still held the marks of Emmett's plane, all of it became property of the First Territorial Bank. Jess was permitted to keep her personal effects. She packed them into a single canvas bag, 2 dresses, a pair of boots with a cracked sole, a skinning knife, Emmett's wool coat, the tin box with its $41, his wedding ring on a leather cord she hung around her neck. The only thing the bank did not take was the hillside itself. The deed was clean. Emmett had paid for the land outright, the one piece of paper that carried no debt. The land agent's signature was still legible at the bottom, almost cheerful in its loops. Nobody from the bank wanted to contest it. The parcel was worth less than the paper it was recorded on. Broken limestone, no water, no timber, no grass worth the name. Cleet Harshaw, who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, 3,000 head across 6 sections of prime bottomland, had once looked at that same hillside while riding with Emmett along the boundary fence. Harshaw had a face like a leather-bound ledger, precise, expensive, closed. He ran his tongue across his lower lip, glanced at the rocky slope, then looked at Emmett, the way a man looks at a child who has just paid good money for a wooden nickel. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who enjoyed being right in front of witnesses. I wouldn't pay $1 for that rock pile if you threw in the view. Emmett had said nothing. He was not the kind of man who argued with people who had already decided. Jess, standing 3 feet behind her husband, had watched Harshaw's face carefully. She noticed that he did not look at the hillside a second time. She noticed that men who dismissed things quickly were often men who had never needed to look closely at anything. Now, 5 months later, Jess stood on that same hillside alone, holding a pickaxe that had belonged to a miner who died in the camp above Garnet before she was born. She had traded a wool blanket for it at the general store. Samuel Fry had accepted the trade without comment, though the blanket was worth twice the tool. He was like that, quiet in his kindnesses, careful never to make them feel like charity. The idea had come to her on the 3rd night after the bank took the cabin. She was sleeping in a shallow overhang on the hillside wrapped in Emmett's coat when she noticed that the air against the rock face felt different from the air in the open. Warmer. Not by much, just enough to notice the way you notice a hand on your shoulder before you see who it belongs to. She pressed her palm against the limestone. The stone held heat from the afternoon sun, the way a cast iron pan holds heat long after the fire dies. But it was more than that. The deeper she reached into the crevice, the more stable the temperature became. The wind could not find her there. The frost could not follow. She thought about that for 3 days before she spoke to anyone. The only person she spoke to was old Tolliver, a former hard rock miner who lived alone in a shack above the tree line and came to town once a month for tobacco salt flour. He was 70 or 80 or some age beyond counting, with hands like gnarled roots, one eye clouded white, a voice like gravel shifting at the bottom of a dry creek bed. Most people in Elkhorn Gulch treated him the way they treated weather. Something that existed, arrived without invitation, could not be changed. Jess found him at the counter of the general store on a September morning. She did not ask him a question. She simply mentioned, in the way a person tests ice before stepping onto a frozen creek, that the rock on her hillside felt warm at night. Tolliver did not look at her. He counted out his tobacco into a leather pouch with the slow precision of a man who had learned that rushing killed people underground. When the pouch was full, he cinched the drawstring tight. His one good eye moved toward the window, toward the hills beyond town. His voice came out flat, without emphasis, the way a man states a fact so obvious he resents having to say it aloud. Limestone breathes, holds heat in winter, holds cool in summer. The Pueblo people knew that 1,000 years before any white man set foot in this territory. He picked up his supplies. He walked out the door. He did not look back. Jess never spoke to him again. She did not need to. The sentence sat inside her like a seed dropped into cracked ground, not planted with care, not watered with encouragement, just fallen into the one place where it could take root. She started digging the next morning. The work was brutal. Limestone is not granite. It will yield to steel, but it yields slowly, grudgingly, one chip at a time. Jess swung the pickaxe from first light until her arms refused to lift it, rested for 10 minutes, then swung again. The technique came back to her in fragments, things Emmett had taught her about reading stone, finding the softer veins following natural fractures instead of fighting them. She was not a miner. She was a carpenter's widow using a miner's tool to do something no one in Elkhorn Gulch had ever attempted. The distinction did not matter. The stone did not care about her credentials. It cared about where she struck, how hard, how many times. Her hands split open within the first week. The skin across both palms cracked along lines that mapped perfectly to the diameter of the pickaxe handle, as though her body was keeping a record of every swing. She wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from a cotton petticoat. The last clean garment she owned, tightened the wraps with her teeth, picked up the tool. Blood soaked through the fabric by noon. She changed the wraps. She kept working. The people of Elkhorn Gulch responded exactly as people respond to anything they cannot categorize. They talked. Word moved through town the way diphtheria had moved through town, from house to house, carried on breath, unstoppable. Men at the feed store chuckled when her name surfaced. She's digging a hole to live in, one of them said, shaking his head with the theatrical pity of a man who has never been desperate enough to understand desperation. Grief got into her head. Another offered, as though grief were a kind of disease contagious only to the weak. Women whispered at the church steps that the young party widow had gone strange, that someone ought to intervene, that it was a shame, a real shame, though none of them walked up the hillside to see what she was actually building. Children were bolder. They scrambled up the ridge in groups of 3 or 4, crouched behind rocks, watched the thin figure in the oversized coat crawl from the narrow opening, covered head, to boots in pale dust, then ran home laughing, carrying the story like a prize. Jess never argued. She never explained. Explanation was a luxury for people who had time, energy, an audience willing to listen. She had none of these. She had a pickaxe, a hillside, $41 in a tin box growing lighter by the week, a deadline that no calendar showed, But every cold morning confirmed winter was coming. It did not negotiate. It did not extend credit. It did not care whether you had a roof or a plan or a prayer. It only cared whether you were warm. Everything else was conversation. By early October, the tunnel had become a room. Not a large room, perhaps 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, 7 feet from floor to ceiling at the center, but a room nonetheless carved from the belly of the hill with nothing but human stubbornness on one end of a hickory handle. Jess reinforced the ceiling with cedar posts she dragged from a creek bed 2 miles south. One log per trip, balanced on her shoulder for the uphill stretches, rolled with her boot on the flat sections. Each post took half a day. She needed 9. She packed the walls with river clay, carried in a dented wheelbarrow she had found half buried behind the burned-out assay office above town. The clay dried hard smooth, nearly white. She cut a ventilation shaft upward through the limestone, the most dangerous work, lying on her back, chipping overhead stone dust, falling into her eyes, her mouth, her lungs until she broke through to the surface and felt the first rush of outside air pour down the shaft like cold water into a warm cup. The shelter was not beautiful. The entrance was barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. The walls were rough where the pickaxe had left its teeth marks. The floor was uneven packed earth that would turn to mud if water found its way in. But the room did what no cabin in Elkhorn Gulch could do. It held temperature. On a night when frost painted the grass white before sunset, Jess sat inside with her back against the cool wall. The lantern turned low, her breath barely visible. Outside, dry wind tore branches from the cottonwoods along the creek. Inside, the air did not move. The stone pressed close, patient, indifferent to the season. The hill kept its own warmth. It did not need fire to prove it. Now she needed something else. Walls could hold heat, but they could not feed her. Warmth without food was just a slower way to die. On a morning in the third week of October, Jess counted the money in the tin box. $23 remained. She put on Emmett's coat. It hung past her wrists, the shoulders dropping halfway to her elbows, making her look even smaller than she was. A girl wearing a ghost. Laced her cracked boots, braided her dark brown hair into a single rope down her back, walked 6 miles to the livestock auction at the railhead outside of town. The auction yard was loud, muddy, full of men who smelled like tobacco leather. The particular confidence that comes from owning things that eat grass while producing money. The expensive cattle sold first heavy Herefords, blocky shorthorns animals whose value was written in the thickness of their haunches. Cleet Harshaw stood in the front row bidding with small nods, his face betraying nothing. The leather-bound ledger opened, then closed. He bought 14 head without appearing to care. Strong horses followed, draft mules, a matched pair of sorrel geldings that drew admiring murmurs from the crowd. Near the end came the animals nobody wanted. 12 goats, small, rough-coated, crooked horns, stood in a makeshift pen at the far edge of the yard. They had bright eyes that never stopped moving, tracking every face, every hand, every shift in the wind. The auctioneer dropped the price twice. A few men laughed. Someone made a joke about brush clearance that earned a round of easy laughter from people who had never needed to think about survival in terms more specific than next quarter's beef prices. Jess raised her hand. The laughter shifted toward her. Not cruel exactly, more the reflexive amusement of people encountering something so far outside their understanding that humor is the only available response. 12 goats sold to the widow who lived in a hole. The auctioneer brought his gavel down quickly, as though he wanted the transaction finished before anyone thought too hard about what it meant. Cleet Harshaw turned. He stood a full head taller than Jess, broad across the chest, his wool vest buttoned tight, his hat pushed back just enough to show a forehead that had never been sunburned because he had not done his own outdoor work in 15 years. His eyes moved from the goats to the girl gathering their lead ropes with hands wrapped in stained cloth. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the yard, not because he raised it, because the yard went quiet to listen. "You're going to survive on goats." It was not a question. It was a verdict delivered with the same tone he used when declining to buy substandard cattle, polite dismissal dressed as observation. Several men behind him nodded. A few smiled. Jess finished tying the last rope. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her eyes met Harshaw's for exactly 1 second, long enough to register, short enough to refuse the invitation to perform. She turned her back, gathered the ropes in her left hand, clicked her tongue once, walked toward the gate. The goats followed in a noisy, jostling line. She did not answer him. She did not owe him a sentence. The only currency she recognized now was time, warmth, calories. Words cost all three while paying nothing back. Harshaw watched her leave. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, the slight straightening of a man who expected a reaction but did not receive one. He turned back to the crowd. The auction moved on. By the time the last mule sold, no one was thinking about the girl with the goats. The walk home took 3 hours. The goats were slow, curious, easily distracted by every thorn bush, every patch of dry grass, every loose stone that might conceal something edible beneath it. Jess did not rush them. She watched them eat as they walked. They pulled at things no cow would touch. Bitter sage, dead thistles, the papery bark of scrub oak. Their mouths never stopped working. Their eyes never stopped scanning. They were, she realized, the only animals at the entire auction that could feed themselves on a hillside made a broken rock where every other creature would starve. She reached the slope just before sunset. The goats scattered across the rocky ground, pulling at thorn bushes, biting the tips of juniper branches, finding food in the cracks between stones where nothing appeared to grow. Jess stood near the entrance of the shelter watching them work. Nothing on that hillside looked valuable. Nothing looked like survival, but every mouth stayed busy. Every step found something where others saw only waste. Before darkness reached the valley floor, Jess guided the herd inside. The entrance was narrow, narrow enough to block wind, narrow enough to defend, but the room beyond opened wide beneath the hill. Fresh straw covered the floor. Bundles of dried grass rested against the back wall. The lantern painted the stone ceiling with warm, unsteady light. The goats circled, once their hooves quiet on the straw, then lay down together in a loose knot of fur horns, steady breathing. Jess hung the thermometer from one of the cedar posts. She watched the needle. Outside, thin ice already formed along the rim of the water bucket near the entrance. Inside, the needle climbed. 48, 52, 56. The body heat of 12 goats joined the thermal mass of the limestone, the sealed clay walls, the straw insulation, the still air that had nowhere to go. The hill was doing exactly what the old miner said it would. Jess sat against the wall with her knees drawn up, Emmett's coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. The wedding ring on its leather cord pressed against her sternum, a small circle of warm metal against skin. She closed her eyes. For the first time since the morning she wiped her face beside his grave, she felt something she could not name. Not hope. Hope was a luxury she had stripped from her vocabulary, along with explanation, argument, complaint. Something smaller, something closer to the ground. The quiet knowledge that she had built a thing with her own bleeding hands that might, if the stone held, if the food lasted, if the ventilation shaft stayed clear, carry her through to the other side of the season, that killed people who were richer, stronger, more certain than she would ever be. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge without finding a way in. Far to the north, beyond the last visible hill, the sky had turned the color of iron. Clouds stacked in long, flat bands along the horizon, building a wall that stretched from one edge of the world to the other, like a door being slowly pulled shut. The horses in the valley below stamped their hooves without knowing why. The crows along the fence line had already gone silent. The air smelled like something was coming, something large, something patient, something that had started moving weeks ago across hundreds of miles of open plain. Jess opened her eyes. Through the ventilation shaft above her head, she could see a single circle of darkening sky. The temperature outside had dropped 6 degrees since she entered the shelter. The goats were already asleep. The lantern burned steady. She pulled the coat tighter. Her voice came out quiet, spoken to no one, or perhaps to the stone itself, or perhaps to the man whose ring pressed against her chest. It's coming sooner than I thought. The days before the storm carried a strange stillness that had nothing to do with peace. October's final week settled over Elkhorn Gulch like a held breath. The kind of silence that makes dogs press their bellies to the floor beneath kitchen tables. The kind that turns milk sour in the pail before noon. Jess felt it in the goats first. They climbed the ridge each morning as usual, pulling at scrub oak, stripping cedar tips, biting the dry stems of ragweed that grew between the stones. But by the fourth day of that stillness, they stopped wandering. They fed close to the entrance, never more than 30 yards from the shelter door, their bright eyes returning again to the northern horizon where the sky had been thickening for 3 days into something that no longer resembled weather. It resembled intention. Jess did not waste the warning. Every remaining cent went into preparation, not the kind that involves confidence or planning for spring, but the stripped, desperate kind that involves counting calories against days, measuring firewood against wind, calculating how long 12 goats can produce milk on stored feed before their bodies begin consuming themselves. She stacked cordwood along the eastern wall of the shelter, split pieces no thicker than her forearm, sized for the tiny sheet iron stove she had bought from a freighter passing through town, who accepted $4 for a unit he called trail camp surplus, but which was in truth a cracked, smoke-blackened box that a real cook would have thrown into a ravine. Jess did not need it to be perfect. She needed it to hold fire. She dried apple slices on flat stones above the ventilation shaft, where the warm updraft from the shelter below turned the fruit leathery within 2 days. She filled grain sacks at the feed store, Samuel Fry weighing each one carefully, adding a few extra pounds when he thought she wasn't watching, though she always was. She bundled willow branches from the creek bed, stripped the bark for the goats, stacked the bare rods for kindling. She carried water in a pair of wooden buckets, trip after trip, filling every vessel inside the shelter until the back wall disappeared behind a row of containers that held enough water for 10 days, if she rationed carefully, 14 if she gave the goats snowmelt instead. Every empty space inside the shelter slowly vanished beneath supplies. The room that had once felt generous began to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, not because they moved, but because the gap between survival and failure was filling with physical weight. Jess moved through the narrowing space with the efficiency of someone who understood that organization was not neatness. Organization was oxygen. One misplaced bucket in the dark could spill a week of water. One poorly stacked cord of wood could block the path to the ventilation shaft. Every object had a position. Every position had a reason. The shelter was not a home. It was a machine built to keep a body alive, each part placed where it needed to be. Nothing decorative, nothing sentimental, nothing present that did not serve the single purpose of lasting until the ground thawed. On the last day of October, Jess walked into Elkhorn Gulch for salt lamp oil, a final sack of grain. The general store hummed with voices. Half a dozen men crowded around the cast iron stove at the center of the room, their boots muddy their coats, open their faces, carrying the ruddy ease of people who believe that preparedness is the same thing as safety. The talk moved in circles the way talk always moves when men are nervous but unwilling to admit it. Big loops of reassurance that return to the starting point without arriving at any conclusion. One voice rose above the rest, thick with the comfort of repetition. They're calling for a hard winter, but we've handled worse. Our barns are built for anything this territory throws. Several heads nodded, the stove ticked, someone spat into a tin cup near the wood box. Cleet Harshaw stood near the window with his arms folded across his vest, watching the street with the proprietary gaze of a man who owned more of what he could see than anyone else in the room. When Harshaw finally turned from the window, his eyes found Jess standing near the counter, waiting for Samuel to measure out lamp oil. Something shifted in his expression, not hostility, not concern, just a reflexive registration of an anomaly. The girl who lived underground, standing among people who lived above it. His voice carried the same casual authority it always carried, the tone of a man who had never been required to raise it. Still under the hill. Jess did not look up from the counter. She watched Samuel pour oil into her tin canister, his hands steady, his face deliberately neutral. When the canister was full, she picked it up, tucked the salt into her coat pocket, balanced the grain sack against her hip. Only then did she meet Harshaw's eyes. Her voice came out flat, stripped of performance, carrying nothing except the fatigue of a person who had spent 14 hours a day for 2 months doing work that would break most of the men in this room. Still alive. The store went quiet for a beat. Not silent, the stove still ticked. Someone's boot still scraped the floorboard, but the particular quiet that descends when a room recognizes it has been answered in a register it did not expect. One man near the stove recovered first, his smile arriving a half-second late. "You'll come running when the snow seals that door shut." Jess lifted her bundle. Her gaze moved across the room without stopping on any single face, the way a person scans a horizon knowing there is nothing there worth focusing on. "If the snow reaches my door, it already buried yours." She stepped through the doorway before the silence broke. The north wind hit her face immediately, carrying a metallic edge that stung the inside of her nostrils. Along the road, 3 horses tied to the rail shifted their weight simultaneously, ears flat, nostrils flared towards something they could sense but not see. A line of crows lifted from the fence posts east of town, not one at a time the way crows leave when startled, but all at once, as though a single signal had passed through them like a current through wire. They flew south without circling. The goats waiting near the wagon path above town stood completely still, not feeding, not shifting, just standing with their heads raised, every ear pointed toward the same invisible line in the north. Animals noticed changes in atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, electrical charge shifts that human senses have been trained to override with logic routine, the comforting belief that tomorrow will resemble today. The goats had no such training. They felt what was coming the way a nerve feels fire, directly without interpretation, without doubt. Jess gathered the lead ropes. She did not hurry. Hurrying would spook them. She walked at their pace up the long slope toward the shelter, her eyes returning twice to the northern sky, where the clouds had flattened into a solid band the color of wet slate, stretching from one edge of the valley to the other, like a door being slowly pulled shut. The air pressure had been dropping since noon. She could feel it in her ears, a faint fullness. The way the world sounds just before it changes its mind about something fundamental. 3 mornings later, the sky disappeared. It happened with a speed that made mockery of every casual prediction spoken around the stove at the general store. At 7 in the morning, the ridgeline stood clear against gray clouds, the valley floor visible for miles, fence posts marking property lines that still meant something. By 8, the world past 50 yards had ceased to exist. Snow came not from above but from every direction, at once horizontal swirling driven by a wind that did not gust but sustain, a constant roar that flattened everything vertical. The temperature did not drop. It collapsed. Water buckets froze solid before noon. The creek stopped moving. Tree branches exploded across the hillsides with sounds like rifle fire, the sap inside them expanding as it crystallized, splitting the wood from the inside out. Fence posts that had held for 5 years snapped at the base. Barn doors that had never failed tore from their hinges like paper. Jess was outside when it started. She had climbed the ridge at first light to check on 2 goats that had wandered beyond the usual grazing line the evening before. She found them pressed against a rock outcropping 200 yards above the shelter, their coats already crusted with ice, their bodies trembling, but their eyes alert. She grabbed the ropes. The wind nearly took her off her feet on the exposed ridge. She leaned into it, pulling the goats behind her, each step a negotiation between her weight, the wind's force, the uncertain footing of frozen rock beneath a layer of snow that was accumulating faster than she could process. By the time she reached the entrance, she could no longer see the valley below. She could barely see her own hands on the ropes. The last 2 goats stumbled through the narrow opening. Jess threw her weight against the heavy oak door, a door she had built herself from planks salvaged from the collapsed assay office hung on iron hinges. She had traded 2 days of labor for fitted into a frame she had chiseled from the limestone with a precision Emmett would have recognized. The door closed. She dropped the wooden bar into its iron cradle. The sound of the bar settling into place was small, definitive, the sound of a line being drawn between two worlds. The change was immediate. Outside, the storm battered the hillside with a fury that vibrated through the stone, a low, continuous rumble that Jess felt in her molars, in the soles of her feet, in the cedar posts that transmitted the tremor like tuning forks buried in rock. Inside, the lantern flame stood straight. The air held still. The temperature on the thermometer held at 54 degrees against the back wall. The goats shook the ice from their coats, sending a spray of crystals across the straw. Then they settled. 12 bodies lowered themselves into the bedding, pressed close, their combined warmth radiating outward into the sealed room like a slow, patient engine that ran on grass grain, the ancient biological machinery of digestion. Jess placed a bundle of willow before the nearest cluster. She warmed goat's milk on the cracked stove. The flame, small, carefully fed the chimney pipe, angled into a natural fissure in the stone that drew smoke upward without backdrafting. Steam rose from the pot into air so still it climbed in a perfect vertical column before dissipating against the ceiling. She poured the milk into a tin cup, wrapped both hands around it. The warmth moved through her palms into her wrists, up her forearms, reaching her chest where the wedding ring on its cord pressed against her sternum. Hours blurred. The storm did not relent. It did not surge in waves the way storms usually do, building, easing, building again. This storm maintained a single sustained intensity that suggested it had no interest in drama, no patience for rhythm. It was not performing. It was executing. Every few hours, Jess climbed the short cedar ladder to the ventilation shaft. This was the most critical task, more important than feeding the goats, more important than rationing water, more important than anything else that happened inside the shelter. One block shaft could end everything beneath the hill. Carbon dioxide from 14 breathing bodies, 12 goats, 2 human lungs would accumulate, thicken, settle. Replace the oxygen molecule by molecule until sleep became unconsciousness, until unconsciousness became something quieter. Each time she pushed the wooden cap open, a blast of Arctic air hammered down the shaft, stealing the shelter's warmth for 30 seconds, 40 before she cleared the packed snow from the opening. Replace the cap, climb back down. Each time the thermometer dropped 2 degrees, each time it recovered within the hour. The hill's thermal mass absorbed the intrusion, neutralized it, returned the room to equilibrium with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than minutes. Night came, though Jess knew it only by the clock, a small brass pocket watch that had been Emmett's wound each morning with 3 careful turns. Above ground, the distinction between day and night had ceased to exist. The storm treated both the same. She lay on her back in the straw, surrounded by goats, their bodies warm against her ribs, her hips, her legs. The lantern was turned low to conserve oil. Shadows moved slowly across the clay walls, like something alive, something watching. For the first time since she began digging the shelter, since the morning after the night beside Emmett's grave when she wiped her face, stood up, picked up a pickaxe, Jess felt something she had not permitted herself to feel. Fear. Not the productive fear that sharpens focus, that turns a person into a more efficient version of themselves. The other kind, the kind that asks questions. What if the ceiling collapses? The cedar posts were sound. She had tested each one, but she was not a mining engineer. She was an 18-year-old widow who had learned construction from a man who built furniture, not tunnels. What if the ventilation shaft freezes shut while she sleeps? She could not stay awake forever. Her body had limits that willpower could not override. What if the storm lasts longer than her supplies? She had calculated for 10 days. What if it lasted 15, 20? What if this was not a storm at all, but something larger, something that had been waiting beyond the northern hills for years? Decades building strength, building patience, waiting for the precise moment when the people of Elkhorn Gulch had convinced themselves they were ready. Her hand found the ring on its cord. She closed her fingers around it. The metal was warm from her skin. It was always warm now, always pressed against her, carrying heat the way it once carried a promise. She held it tightly, feeling the circle of it, the completeness of a shape that has no beginning, no end, no weak point where force can find a way in. Her breathing slowed. The fear did not leave. She did not expect it to. But something settled beneath it, something harder, something that did not argue with the fear, but simply refused to move. She opened her eyes in the near darkness. The goats breathed around her in a rhythm so steady it resembled a pulse. Not her pulse, not theirs individually, but the pulse of the shelter itself, the underground room that was now the only warm place in a valley being buried alive. Not yet. The words came out quiet, meant for no one, or for the ring, or for the man who once wore it. She released the metal. She sat up. She climbed the ladder. She checked the shaft. The snow had packed 3 inches deep since the last clearing. She dug it out with her bare hands, the cold biting into her skin like something with teeth. When the shaft was clear, she replaced the cap, climbed down, dried her hands against her coat. She did not sleep for the rest of that night. By morning, if the clock could be trusted, the storm had grown worse. Late on the second night, the goats told her something was wrong before her own senses caught up. Every animal in the shelter lifted its head simultaneously. Not slowly the way goats raise their heads when curious. Instantly the way prey animals respond to a predator, ears forward, bodies rigid, 12 pairs of eyes locked on the heavy oak door. Jess froze. She held her breath, listening past the storm's roar for something beneath it, something the goats had already found. For 10 seconds she heard only wind. Then came a sound that did not belong to the storm, a dull, irregular impact against the door. Not the rhythmic pounding of a branch blown loose. Something weaker. Something with a pattern that suggested intention rather than accident. Thump. Pause. Thump. Then silence. Then a voice so thin it barely survived the passage through oak, through snow, through the howling air between the living and the almost dead. Please. Jess moved to the door. She gripped the iron bar with both hands. For one breath, maybe two, she stood without lifting it. The shelter was sealed. The temperature was holding. The supplies were calculated for one person, 12 goats, a fixed number of days. Every body she added shortened the math. Every inch the door opened invited the storm inside, stole heat that the hill would need hours to replace, risked the only equilibrium she had built between survival and the endless appetite of a Montana winter. The calculus was simple. The calculus was also inhuman. She lifted the bar. The door moved 3 inches before packed snow jammed the gap. Frigid air punched through the opening like a fist, dropping the temperature in the entrance by 20 degrees in a single second. A shape fell through the narrow space, not stepped. Fell the boneless collapse of a body that had used its last reserves to reach this point. The shape hit, the straw coughed once, did not move. Behind it, a second figure forced through the gap, brought her heavier, crashing against the first before sliding sideways against the clay wall. Jess threw her weight against the door. Snow resisted. She drove her shoulder into the oak, her boots sliding on straw, her breath coming in sharp gasps until the door closed with a sound like a jaw snapping shut. The bar dropped back into place. Silence returned, or what passed for silence, which was the storm's muffled roar filtered through 8 feet of limestone layered beneath the rough, desperate breathing of 2 people who had arrived at the only warm place left in Elkhorn Gulch by a path that should have killed them. The first man was Samuel Fry. His beard had frozen into a white mask of ice. His fingers were locked into claws, the joints seized the skin beneath his nails, already turning the waxy yellow-gray that meant the tissue beneath was dying. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the lantern flame with the blank intensity of a man watching the last visible proof that warmth still exists somewhere in the universe. Behind Samuel, propped against the wall where he had fallen, sat Cleet Harshaw, the largest cattle rancher in Elkhorn Gulch, the man whose barns were built for anything, the man who would not pay $1 for a rock pile if you threw in the view. His expensive wool coat had frozen stiff, the fibers locked into a rigid shell that no longer bent at the elbows. Ice filled the creases around his eyes. His hat was gone. His gaze rested on the lantern with an expression Jess had never seen on his face, the total absence of authority. He was not Cleet Harshaw in this room. He was a body that needed warmth, receiving it from a hole in the ground. He had mocked surrounded by goats he had laughed at alive. Because a girl he had dismissed had opened a door she had every practical reason to keep shut. Jess knelt between them. She poured warm goat's milk into 2 tin cups, her hands steady despite the cold still radiating from their bodies. Drink slowly. Neither man resisted. The milk disappeared in small, careful swallows, the involuntary caution of throats so cold that even warmth felt like a threat. Minutes passed. Color returned first to Samuel's face, a faint pink spreading from his neck upward like sunrise creeping across a snowfield. Harshaw took longer. His body had been closer to the edge. Samuel told her how they found the shelter. His voice cracked, halting assembled from fragments, the way a man rebuilds a sentence after a blow to the head. He had closed the store late. The storm arrived faster than anyone predicted. He could not reach his boarding house 2 blocks north, 2 blocks that had become an impassable canyon of horizontal snow. He fought his way east toward Harshaw's ranch, the closest structure with solid walls. Harshaw let him in. For 6 hours, they fed the stove-boarded windows, listened to the wind, dismantled the barn roof 1 plank at a time. Then the main door failed. The frame split. Snow invaded the front room so fast, they retreated to the kitchen, then to the root cellar, then to nowhere. Every room breached every wall, proving that wood, no matter how thick, is just organized air, waiting to be rearranged by a force that does not recognize property lines. Harshaw remembered the hillside, not because he respected it, because he had dismissed it so thoroughly that its location was fixed in his memory, the way insults are fixed precisely permanently without effort. He knew where the entrance faced. He knew the slope. He knew the fence line of stacked stones that ran along the eastern boundary of the party parcel, because he had once pointed at those stones from horseback while explaining to a visitor exactly how worthless the land was. That fence line, those worthless stones, became the only navigable landmark in a world where every other reference point had been erased. They followed it uphill, blind bent double against the wind, Harshaw breaking trail, Samuel stumbling behind him, both men burning through the last reserves of core temperature that separated consciousness from collapse. Jess listened without interrupting. When Samuel finished, she placed a folded blanket beneath his shoulders, tucked straw around his legs. She did the same for Harshaw, who accepted it without protest. Hours passed. The storm continued. Jess checked the ventilation shaft on schedule. She fed the goats on schedule. She heated milk on schedule. The routine was not flexible. Flexibility was a luxury for people who had margins. She had none. Every task existed in a sequence that kept the system alive, each step dependent on the one before it, a chain that could not lose a link without risking every link that followed. On the second night inside the shelter, Harshaw could not sleep. He sat against the clay wall watching Jess work, not the way he watched things outside this room with judgment, with the measuring eye of a man calculating value. He watched the way a person watches a craftsman following the movements without commentary. She climbed the ladder to check the shaft. She cleared the snow with precise, unhurried strokes. She descended, checked the thermometer, adjusted the stove draft, fed willow bundles to the nearest goats, poured milk, distributed water. Every motion had a purpose. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was repeated. The shelter ran like a mechanism because the woman at its center understood exactly what each part needed, exactly when it needed it, exactly what would fail if she stopped paying attention for even one cycle. Harshaw looked down at his own hands thawing, now the pain returning in sharp waves as circulation fought its way back into frozen tissue. Hands that had signed contracts pointed at maps gestured from horseback, while hired men did the work his body had forgotten how to do. Then his eyes moved to Jess's hands. Cracked, scarred, wrapped in cloth so stained with blood, dirt, limestone dust, that the original color was unrecoverable. Hands that had carved a room from solid rock, dragged cedar posts 2 miles uphill, built a door from salvaged planks, kept 14 living creatures alive inside a hill, while the most expensive infrastructure in the valley collapsed like paper above them. When Jess brought this next cup of warm milk, Harshaw took it with both hands. He held it for a moment before drinking the tin, warming his palms, the steam rising between them. His voice came out low, rough, stripped of every tone she had ever heard him use: the authority, the dismissal, the casual cruelty of certainty. Thank you. 2 words. Jess had heard him speak hundreds of words over the months she had lived in Elkhorn Gulch, at the auction, at the store, on the road, always with the easy volume of a man who expected to be heard because he had always been heard. These 2 words were different. They cost him something. She could see the cost in the way his jaw tightened after he spoke, the way his eyes dropped to the cup, the way his shoulders settled beneath the thawing coat. It was the first time in his life she was certain of this, without knowing how, that Cleet Harshaw had spoken those words to someone who owned nothing he valued in a place he had publicly scorned, while wearing a debt he could never repay with money. Jess took the empty cup. She did not smile. She did not nod. She refilled it, handed it to Samuel, turned back to the stove. The shelter did not require acknowledgement. It required maintenance. Gratitude was real, but it did not keep anyone warm. Work did. On the third morning, if the clock was right, if time still moved the same way underground as it moved above, the sound changed. Jess noticed it first as an absence, the low, constant vibration that had lived in the stone walls for 3 days. The subsonic hum of wind striking limestone at 60 miles an hour was gone. The silence that replaced it felt almost aggressive, a void so complete that her ears rang from the lack of input, the way eyes see phantom light in total darkness. She climbed the ladder. At the top of the ventilation shaft, where packed snow had greeted her every 4 hours for 3 days, a narrow beam of sunlight fell through the opening. It struck the shaft wall at an angle, a thin blade of gold against gray stone, the first natural light she had seen since she dropped the bar across the door. She smiled. The expression felt unfamiliar on her face, the muscles remembering a configuration they had not been asked to hold in days. Below her, the goat stirred. Samuel shifted in his blankets. Harshaw opened his eyes. It's over. Getting out proved harder than staying alive inside. Snow had buried the entrance completely, not drifted against it, the way snow collects on a porch, but packed solid, compressed by 3 days of wind into a wall of white concrete that did not yield to fists, did not yield to boots, did not yield to anything short of sustained, methodical excavation. Jess took the shovel. Harshaw took a cedar plank pried from the interior wall bracing. They worked upward from the door, carving a tunnel through compacted snow that rose more than 5 feet above the threshold. Each shovelful heavier than the last, because the snow near the surface had been wind-hammered into a density closer to ice than powder. The work was slow. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for Jess's shoulders, impossible for Harshaw until she widened the passage behind her. She dug on her knees, then on her stomach, pushing loose snow backward between her legs for Harshaw to clear. Fresh airflow from a fully open door was not a comfort. It was a necessity measured in parts per million. After nearly an hour, the shovel blade broke through the surface. Sunlight poured into the tunnel so bright that Jess closed her eyes involuntarily. Her pupils contracted to pinpoints after 3 days of lantern glow. Cold air rushed down the passage, not the violent predatory cold of the storm, but something quieter, cleaner, the still cold of aftermath. She widened the opening. She crawled through. The world above was unrecognizable. Jess stood on the hillside, knee-deep in snow that stretched in every direction without interruption. A single white surface that had erased every feature the valley once used to identify itself. Fence lines gone. Roads gone. The wagon path she walked to town buried so completely that its route existed only in the memory of people who had used it before the storm, decided that human paths were suggestions, not facts. Barn roofs lay submerged beneath smooth drifts that rose to 15 feet in places where the wind had funneled between structures. Only chimneys remained visible, dark vertical lines poking through the white expanse like the masts of ships sunk in a frozen harbor. Most of them produced no smoke. The goats emerged one by one from the tunnel behind her, blinking in the brightness, shaking their coats. Then something remarkable happened. They stepped onto the snow surface without sinking. Their small hooves wide, relative to their body weight, distributed their mass across the frozen crust, the way snowshoes distribute a biological advantage that no horse, no cow, no animal bred for the valley's prosperous economy could replicate. They walked on top of the snow that had buried everything designed to survive winter, through size, through expense, through confidence. Harshaw climbed out last. He stood on the ridge, breathing hard from the dig, his thawed coat hanging loose on a frame that had lost visible weight in 3 days. His eyes tracked south toward the bottomland, where his ranch occupied 6 sections of what had been 1 week ago the most valuable property in Elkhorn Gulch. No buildings were visible. The main house, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed, the 3-bay barn he had built with lumber shipped from Missoula at a cost that exceeded Jess's entire existence, all of it was beneath the snow. The only evidence that a ranch had ever existed was a single fence post leaning at 45 degrees, its top wire snapped clean, pointing at nothing. Harshaw removed his hat. He held it against his chest with both hands. He did not speak. His face simply emptied the way a face empties when the distance between what a man believed about himself 3 days ago, his competence, his resources, his dominion over a valley he had measured in cattle acres dollars, collapses into the distance between where he stands now in a landscape that does not remember his name. Jess let the silence hold for 10 seconds. Then she pulled the lead rope gently. "We're going to town." The walk to Elkhorn Gulch normally took an hour at a steady pace along the wagon road. Today it took nearly 3. The road did not exist. Jess navigated by ridgeline, by the angle of the sun, by the position of a rock outcropping above the tree line that the snow had not fully buried. The goats led the way, their hooves finding purchase on the crust, their bodies cutting a narrow trail that Jess followed her boots, breaking through the surface every few steps, sinking to mid-thigh before she hauled herself out. Harshaw followed in her tracks. Samuel Fry walked between them using a cedar branch as a walking stick, his frost-bitten fingers wrapped in strips of blanket. He moved slowly but without complaint, the quiet endurance of a man who had spent years carrying grain sacks, stacking shelves, performing labor that no one noticed because it lacked the spectacle of ranching or mining, but required the same stubbornness that keeps a body moving when the body would rather stop. Along the route, the storm's ledger became visible. Cattle lay scattered across the open range, dark shapes frozen in the positions where the cold had finally overtaken them. Some standing upright, locked in place by ice that had formed faster than their legs could collapse. Their eyes open, their bodies already becoming landmarks in a landscape stripped of every other reference point. Dozens were visible from the ridge alone. The full count would take weeks to establish. The open range model that had built Elkhorn Gulch's economy, the assumption that cattle could survive a Montana winter on open grass with occasional shelter from a barn or a windbreak, had been tested against a storm that did not recognize assumptions. The results were frozen into the hillsides in shapes that would not move until spring. Nobody spoke during the walk. There was nothing to say that the landscape was not already saying louder, more clearly, with the permanent authority of evidence that cannot be argued away by men around a stove. They reached Main Street just after noon. The town looked as though it had been struck by something heavier than weather. Roof planks lay scattered across the snow. The livery stable's front wall had buckled inward. The frame splintered, the interior exposed like a broken rib cage. The church bell tower, which had always leaned 2 degrees east, now leaned 30. Its base cracked, the bell itself visible through a gap in the siding, hanging silent at an angle that guaranteed it would never ring true again. Windows were shattered in every building on the north side of the street, the side that had faced the wind directly without the protection of any structure large enough to break the current. A voice called from the town hall, a 2-story brick building at the center of Main Street, the only structure in Elkhorn Gulch built from material that a wind of that magnitude could not disassemble. Jess moved toward it. The goats followed their hooves, clicking on patches of exposed boardwalk between drifts. Inside the town hall, Elkhorn Gulch had been reduced to its essential components. 40 or 50 people, men, women, children, occupied the main room, sitting on benches on the floor on piles of salvaged blankets, that smelled like smoke, damp wood fear. Children sat in tight clusters wrapped in quilts, their faces carrying the particular stillness of young people who have absorbed a terror they do not yet have vocabulary to describe. Older men sat near the cast iron stove at the room's center. The stove was cold. The firebox was empty. The last fuel had been burned sometime during the second day of the storm, when the volunteers who had fought their way to the woodpile behind the building discovered that the woodpile was now beneath 6 feet of snow, unreachable without tools that were buried inside buildings that could no longer be entered. The room was not warm. It was merely less cold than outside, a distinction that saves no one over time, that only extends the interval between consciousness and the quiet arithmetic of hypothermia. People were alive in this room. They were not surviving. They were waiting in the passive, diminishing way that organisms wait when the last variable they controlled has been removed. Jess walked through the doorway with 12 goats behind her. The room changed. Not all at once, not the way rooms change in stories where a single entrance rewrites every face simultaneously. It changed the way temperature changes inside a limestone hill, slowly, steadily beginning at the edges before reaching the center. The people nearest the door saw the goats first. Their expression shifted from exhaustion to confusion, the involuntary recalibration of a brain encountering something so far outside the expected category of rescue that it cannot immediately classify what it is seeing. Then the confusion spread inward, person by person, row by row, until every face in the town hall was turned toward the entrance, where a thin girl in a dead man's coat stood holding a lead rope connected to 12 animals that most of them had laughed about in October. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered. The room held a silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of recognition. The collective wordless acknowledgement that the person standing in the doorway had been right about something fundamental, while everyone else in the room had been wrong about the same thing. Jess tied the black nanny goat to a bench near the center of the room. She knelt beside the animal, placed a bucket beneath her udder, began milking with the practiced efficiency of hands that had performed this task twice daily for 2 months. The milk hit the tin bucket with a rhythm that sounded in the frozen silence of that room, like the first clock ticking in a house where time had stopped. Children first. The line formed without instruction. No one organized it. No one directed the small bodies forward or held the larger ones back. The room simply reorganized itself around a priority so obvious that it required no authority to enforce, only a bucket of warm milk, a tin cup, a steady hand pouring. The first child to drink was a girl of 5 or 6, blonde hair matted against her forehead. Her lips cracked, her small fingers so cold they could barely hold the cup. Jess steadied it for her, one hand beneath the child's hands, tipping the cup slowly. The girl drank with her eyes closed. When she finished, she did not let go of the cup immediately. She held it against her chest, not for what it contained, but for the warmth it carried, the proof that somewhere, somehow, a living system was still producing heat in a world that had been trying to freeze everything solid for 3 days. An older woman in this corner began crying without sound. Tears ran down her face in 2 straight lines, cutting through the grime of 3 days without water to wash, without fire to warm. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying because the cup of milk moving through the room meant that the interval between this moment and death had just been extended by a margin she could measure for the first time since the stove went dark in something other than hours. Harshaw opened the hall door. He guided the remaining goats inside one by one, distributing them through the room with a careful deliberation that Jess had not seen from him before, the movements of a man who was not giving orders, but following a logic he was learning in real time. The goats settled among the families, their bodies compact, dense, radiating the steady metabolic heat of animals designed by 10,000 years of mountain survival to maintain core temperature in conditions that killed larger, more impressive creatures, became heat sources. People pressed close. Hands that had been clenched in pockets for 3 days reached into the thick coats of fur fingers, disappearing into the warm undercoat near the animals' bellies. the warmth transferring through skin contact in a transaction so simple, so ancient, that it predated language currency, every system humans had invented to distribute resources. Tom Delaney, who ran the feedlot, was holding his young son against a brown nanny goat. The child's body was limp, his eyes closed, his skin the color of tallow. The boy had stopped shivering, which was not a good sign. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. The absence of shivering meant the body had begun to surrender. Jess took the child from his father's arms, placed him on the straw between two goats, pressed their warm bodies against his chest, his back. She tucked a blanket over all three, the child sandwiched between two living furnaces, their breathing steady, their warmth constant. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then the boy's fingers twitched. Then his eyelids moved. Then a small sound escaped his lips, something between a moan of pain, the pain of nerves reawakening, and the involuntary vocalization of a body remembering that it is still alive. Tom Delaney dropped to his knees beside his son. He did not speak. He placed one hand on the goat's flank, the other on his boy's forehead, his face breaking apart in the way that faces break only when hope returns after hope has already been buried. Harshaw watched this from across the room. His expression moved through something more complex than guilt, deeper than regret, older than the version of himself that had stood at an auction yard 3 weeks ago, making jokes about brush eaters. When the boy opened his eyes, when Tom Delaney's shoulders shook with the particular violence of a father's relief, Harshaw lowered his head. His lips moved. Two words spoken to no one in the room, possibly to the goat, possibly to the girl across the hall who was already milking the next animal, possibly to a version of himself that no longer existed. I was wrong. Jess did not hear him. She was working. There were 40 cups to fill 12 goats, to rotate a schedule, to establish which animals to milk, which to rest, how long to leave the goats among the families before bringing them to the door for a feeding cycle, how to ration the grain. She had brought in her coat pockets, a handful, barely enough for 2 animals, supplemented by whatever dried bark. Whatever frozen brush the goats could find in the brief periods when the hall door opened for ventilation. The system was fragile. It could not sustain 50 people indefinitely. It could sustain them long enough. Long enough was the only unit of measurement that mattered in Elkhorn Gulch that week. Long enough for the temperature to rise above zero. Long enough for men to dig pathways to buried woodpiles. Long enough for the first fire to be relit in the town hall stove, the smoke rising from the chimney like a signal not to anyone outside, because no one outside was coming but to the people inside, who needed to see evidence that the world's oldest human technology still functioned after the world's newest catastrophe had tried to make it irrelevant. Samuel Fry, despite his frostbitten hands, was the one who organized the digging crew that reached the woodpile on the second day, directing men with his elbows when his fingers could not grip, pointing with a bandaged fist at the spot where the snow was thinnest, refusing to sit down until the first armload of split oak reached the stove. He did not need to be asked. He had spent years anticipating what a store full of customers needed before they said it aloud. A frozen town hall full of survivors was not so different. The goats provided the bridge between the cold stove of the first day and the burning stove of the fourth 72 hours of biological warmth, measured in milk, in body heat, in the stubborn refusal of 12 animals to stop converting scrub brush into calories, while every more expensive creature in the valley lay frozen in the fields. The thaw came slowly. It always does in Montana, not a sudden warming, but a grudging retreat. Winter pulling back inch by inch, yielding ground, the way a retreating army yields ground, destroying what it can't hold. The snow settled, compacted, turned granular. Meltwater appeared in the creeks, first a trickle, then a steady flow carrying debris from the hillsides, broken fence rails, shingle fragments, a child's boot, the carcass of a calf still wearing the brand of Harshaw's ranch. The valley revealed its losses the way a receding tide reveals a shipwreck, gradually, piece by piece, each new exposure confirming what the people of Elkhorn Gulch already suspected, but had not yet been forced to see with their own eyes. Hundreds of cattle lay across the open range. The count would eventually reach somewhere near 1,000. No one kept an exact number because exactness implied a system of record keeping that had been destroyed along with everything else. Barns leaned at impossible angles, their frames twisted by wind loads they were never engineered to resist. The livery stable was a total loss. 3 homes on the north side of town had lost their roofs entirely. The church bell tower had to be pulled down by rope before it collapsed on its own. Harshaw's ranch, the largest operation in the valley, the symbol of everything that money planning conventional wisdom could build, had lost 60% of its herd, both storage barns, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed. The main house still stood, but its north wall had been breached. The interior soaked the furniture, ruined the documents in Harshaw's study contracts. Deeds, herd records. 15 years of careful accounting reduced to pulp. The rebuilding began before the snow finished melting because people who wait for perfect conditions in Montana territory do not rebuild at all. But something had shifted in the way Elkhorn Gulch understood shelter. The old logic tall walls, heavy roofs, barns, sized to impress had been tested to failure. People who had measured safety by the height of their structures, the thickness of their lumber, the number of nails per joint, were now measuring it by a different standard. They were measuring it by what remained after the wind stopped. On an afternoon in late March, when the first bare ground appeared on the south-facing slopes, Harshaw drove his wagon up the path to Jess's hillside. The wagon carried cedar logs, 6 of them, fresh-cut, stripped of bark, stacked neatly in the bed. He set the brake. He climbed down. He removed his hat before speaking, holding it in front of his chest with both hands, the way he had held it on the ridge after the storm. But the gesture meant something different now. On the ridge, it had been the posture of a man absorbing loss. Here it was the posture of a man delivering something he owed. The town voted last week, we're going to build a community shelter, something underground, something that holds. I'm donating the east section of my ranch, that limestone ridge above the creek. He paused. His jaw worked the way it worked when words cost him something. We were hoping you'd show us how. Jess stood near the entrance of her shelter, the shovel resting against her shoulder, the same way the pickaxe had rested on the first morning of the story, when an 18-year-old girl stood halfway inside a hillside swinging steel into stone. She looked up at the ridge where the afternoon light caught a cluster of small figures, children from town already climbing the slope, already driving wooden stakes into the soft spring earth, marking the dimensions of something they did not yet know how to build, but understood with the instinct of a generation that had survived a lesson no classroom could teach needed to exist. Bring more cedar. Harshaw nodded. We will. The construction of the community shelter took 6 weeks. Jess worked alongside the crews, demonstrating rather than explaining, showing the men of Elkhorn Gulch how to read a limestone face for soft veins, how to angle a ventilation shaft to prevent backdraft, how to seat a cedar post so the weight of the ceiling transferred through the wood into the bedrock rather than into the packed earth, which would shift with the seasons. She showed them how to mix river clay with straw for a sealant that dried hard enough to shed water, but flexible enough to absorb the hill's seasonal expansion without cracking. She showed them where to position the entrance facing southeast, away from the prevailing winter wind, how to build a door, how wide to cut the passage, how deep to excavate before the temperature stabilized. Harshaw worked every day. He hauled cedar logs from the creek himself, stripped bark with a draw knife, carried posts on his shoulder the way Jess had carried them months earlier, one at a time uphill, sweating through his shirt by mid-morning. His hands, which had signed contracts for 15 years, while hired men did the physical labor, blistered within the first week. He wrapped them in cloth strips, without complaint, without mention. The quiet penance of a 53-year-old body performing work it had spent decades delegating. He simply arrived each morning, picked up the next log, began walking uphill. On the 4th week of construction, the crew broke into a natural cavity in the hillside, a small chamber perhaps 6 feet across, hidden behind a thin wall of limestone that shattered under the third swing of a pickaxe. Inside they found the remains of a camp, a fire ring built from stacked stones blackened by use, a wool blanket folded neatly in the corner, moth-eaten, faded to the color of dust. 3 empty tin cans, tobacco salt flour arranged in a row against the wall, labels long since dissolved, a candle stub melted to the stone floor. The remnants of a life lived underground by someone who had understood what limestone could do, long before Jess picked up a pickaxe, long before the storm, long before any of them had been forced to learn. Old Tolliver. His name moved through the crew in a murmur. No one had seen him since before the storm. No one had looked for him because no one had thought to look, because Tolliver existed in the town's awareness the way weather existed, present, uncontrollable, not particularly important until it was gone. The camp was cold. The fire ring held no warmth. But the blanket was folded, the tins were arranged. The space was orderly, the habits of a man who expected to return, or who maintained order simply because order was a last discipline available to a person who had given up every other form of control. Whether he had survived the storm in some other hole, some other cavity in the mountains above the tree line, no one knew. No body was found. No tracks led away from the chamber. Jess stood in the small room for a long time after the crew moved on. She looked at the fire ring, the blanket, the tins. She was not the first person to understand this hillside. She was not the first person to read limestone the way a carpenter reads wood grain for strength, for direction, for the hidden logic that determines what will hold weight, what will split under pressure. Tolliver had known. The Pueblo people before him had known. The knowledge was older than Elkhorn Gulch, older than Montana Territory, older than any deed recorded in any office in Helena. It was written in the stone itself, available to anyone willing to look closely enough. Listen quietly enough, trust the earth more than the structures men built on top of it. She touched the folded blanket once lightly, the way a person touches a headstone. Then she picked up her shovel, returned to the main excavation, resumed working without mentioning what she had felt in that small room. Some debts are not spoken. They are carried forward in the work itself. The community shelter was finished in May. It could hold 80 people. The entrance faced southeast. The ventilation system used 3 shafts instead of 1. The ceiling was supported by 32 cedar posts seated in bedrock. The walls were sealed with clay, the floor covered in packed gravel for drainage, the interior divided into sections, 1 for people, 1 for livestock, 1 for supplies. It was not beautiful. Nothing about it would impress a visitor from Helena or Butte or any city where safety was measured in paint glass architecture. But it was correct. Every angle, every measurement, every material choice reflected a single principle that Jess had learned not from books, not from engineers, not from anyone who had ever written a word about construction, but from a hillside that breathed a winter that killed a tin cup of warm goat's milk handed to a child who could not hold it by herself. On the day the shelter was declared complete, the town gathered at the entrance. Someone had carved a date into the limestone above the door, 1884. Nothing else. No name, no dedication. Jess had refused all 3 when the town council offered. She stood at the edge of the crowd near the back, one hand resting on the black nanny goat's neck. Harshaw had been asked to speak. He looked at the entrance for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the way it always did, but the tone belonged to a different man than the one who had stood at an auction yard 6 months earlier, assessing the world through the narrow lens of what he could buy. This shelter belongs to everyone. It was designed by someone who lost everything except the ground under her feet, then proved that ground was enough. He did not look at Jess when he spoke. He did not need to. Every person in the crowd knew. The crowd dispersed. Families walked back toward town, toward homes being rebuilt with deeper foundations, thicker walls, root cellars dug twice as deep as before. New mounds of earth appeared on the hillsides above Elkhorn Gulch. Throughout that spring, private shelters, family shelters, modest excavations by people who had learned at a cost none of them would have chosen to pay. That the measure of safety is not what you build above the ground, but what remains when everything above the ground is taken away. Jess walked back to her hillside alone. The goats followed at their own pace, spreading across the rocky slope, pulling at new growth, green shoots emerging between the stones, where nothing had appeared to grow 6 months before. She reached the entrance of her shelter. She set the shovel against the limestone the way she always did. Handle up, blade resting in the groove. It had worn into the rock through months of repetition. A small mark that would outlast her. Outlast the shelter. Outlast the story itself. The wedding ring pressed against her sternum beneath the coat. The afternoon light stretched across the valley, painting the ridgelines gold. Below, smoke rose from the chimneys of Elkhorn Gulch, thin columns climbing straight into still air. Evidence of a town that had been broken, frozen, starved to the edge of extinction, then brought back by something no one had thought to value until it was the only thing left. Jess did not look back toward town. She did not need to see what was behind her. What was behind her had already been built. What was ahead of her was simpler, a hillside, a herd, a room carved from stone, the slow accumulation of seasons. Another winter would come. It would find her in the same place, doing the same work, keeping the same watch she had kept since the morning she wiped her face beside a grave, stood up, picked up a pickaxe, began swinging into solid rock, as if every strike carried the weight of another winter she could not afford to lose. Let them come, those winters. The hill was ready, so was she.